Welcome to Knowledge 3, where we're talking about the ancient Greek civilizations. And sadly, we are on our last read aloud. But in the sadness, I'm pretty excited because we're talking about Alexander the Great again. He's such a cool character to talk about. And, and we're talking about these nonfiction stories about this just awesome human being. Before we talk more about Alexander the Great, let's go through our vocabulary words. I will read the word. You will repeat that word after me. Marvelous, ambitious, mission, grand, Spartan, ideal, democracy, tribute, prefer. So, what would be the word if you really wanted to have great success and you never gave up doing that? What word would you use? Yeah, I would use the word ambitious. Here again, we've been going through many lessons of our Greek civilizations. We've been talking about the different components that make up a civilization. And here's our completed chart. So we've talked about many things from jobs like farming, shepherding, seafaring, their religion, and all the things they have with that. The two city-states we talked about, Sparta and Athens. Our two leaders we've talked about, Pericles, and we're going to talk again about Alexander the Great, and the many contributions. Remember, things that started back with the ancient Greeks and are still being used today. Here's a prediction. Let's make a prediction about today's read aloud. What do you think would be Alexander's greatest adventure? What would be Alexander's greatest adventure? After today's reading, you should be able to characterize the accomplishments of Alexander the Great and demonstrate an understanding of the word invader. So as we go through our read aloud today of Alexander the Great, listen to find out carefully if your predictions about Alexander the greatest adventures are correct. King Alexander of Macedonia led his Greek soldiers on foot across Europe and then by ship across the channel of water that separated Europe from Asia. Remember, that was the same channel that Xerxes crossed with that boat bridge. As the boats approached the far shore, Alexander flung his spear so that it landed pointed end first in the Asian soil. Stepping from his boat, he freed the spear and told his cheering men, "We will conquer Asia with our spears." Leading the army down the coast of the Aegean Sea, he stopped at the site of the ancient Troy. Here, 9 centuries before, the Greeks had fought a famous war, the story of which had been told in a well-known book called the Iliad. Since boyhood, Alexander had set a goal for himself. I want people to remember me forever as a great hero, just as we remember Achilles, the greatest hero in the Iliad, he said. That goal of undying fame, more than anything else, would drive Alexander onward through his many adventures. As Alexander continued down the Aegean coast, citizens of Greek city-states that had developed in Asia welcomed Alexander's army. "Alexander will free us from Persian rule," the people cheered. "We will live as free Greeks once more." Alexander told them, "Yes, we will free you." Do you think this was true? Yet, once his army took over a city or a nation, Alexander never gave up his control. He was determined to set the record for ruling the greatest empire in history, and he didn't think he could do that by freeing people and places he had conquered. So, how do you think the Greek people felt about King Alexander after they realized he wasn't going to let them live freely? Do you think they continued to cheer for him? Soon, Alexander's soldiers found themselves facing an enormous Persian army sent by the Persian king. Between the two armies lay a river. Alexander charged across the river, calling, "Follow me!" with his men rushing to keep up. They won the battle. Afterwards, they reached the city of Gordia, where Alexander was shown the chariot of the ancient founder of the city. The ancient chariot was tied to a pole with a large knot. The elderly priest smiled at the young invader. Legend says that only he who unties the Gordian knot can rule Asia, the priest said, knowing it would take days or weeks to do so. But with lightning speed, Alexander drew his sword and in one mighty stroke sliced the knot in half. "What a pleasant legend," he said, and rode on laughing. So did King Alexander actually untie the knot? What do you see in this picture? Alexander continued to Egypt, which was also under Persian control. He defeated the Persian armies there, and the Egyptians proclaimed him Pharaoh, or king. While in Egypt and all through his travels, he sent samples of local plants and animals to his old teacher, Aristotle, so the great scientist could examine them. Why do you think he sent plants and animals to Aristotle? Alexander also tried to answer a question the wise men had long hoped to figure out. Why does the Nile River flood in the spring? "I cannot prove it without following the river all the way to its beginnings," Alexander wrote, "and this I have no time to do. But after talking with the most educated Egyptians, I believe during each spring rain fills the lakes in the mountains of northern Africa. The lakes overflow into the Nile, which carries the water down to the flatlands of Egypt." And he was right, and Aristotle sent a letter of thanks. By the time the letter reached Alexander, however, he was back in Persia, winning battle after battle. At one of these battles, the Persians had many more soldiers than Alexander commanded. The Persian king felt so sure of victory that he left his family and a good deal of his treasure in a nearby city. When Alexander won the fight, he marched into the city and took the king's treasure for himself and his men. After several more victories, Alexander at last defeated the Persians for good and crowned himself king of Asia. As he continually fought these wars, Alexander insisted that his goal was to win glory for himself and his troops, and to prove no one else was stronger in force. Do you think this was a good idea to have, or a good goal to have? After Alexander's success, thousands of Greek soldiers married Persian women. He also took Persian soldiers into his army so they could learn Greek ideas from his soldiers. He and his lifelong best friend even married two of the king of Persia's daughters in a double wedding ceremony. "We will unite all our empire into one great nation," Alexander proclaimed. Alexander was so busy trying to conquer more and more places that he was not able to give much attention to the places he had already taken over. Do you think his lack of attention was helpful or hurtful to Alexander's rule? Instead, he left behind generals he trusted to rule for him, or let the kings he had conquered continue to run their countries while reporting to him. Then Alexander moved on. Without more attention on his part, his grand plan never completed, or never completely succeeded. At the same time, Alexander began to claim, I am one of the gods, for who but a god could do all that I have done? It was around this time that people began to refer to him as Alexander the Great. Probably he himself was the first one to say it. Always restless, he was never satisfied that he had done enough in his life. Even conquering Persia did not satisfy him. We will continue east to India, he ordered. Fighting over great distances and rugged mountains, Alexander's soldiers reached northern India, where they found themselves facing a strong Indian army that featured a terrible new threat. What on earth is that thing? One Macedonian soldier asked another. I don't know, replied his friend, but I've never seen anything so big. In fact, the monsters they were facing were elephants, atop which rode Indian soldiers, directing the huge beasts to attack and trample their enemies. Alexander ordered to the front of his army spearmen, carrying spears 21 feet long. He told them, do not let those beasts get close enough to reach you. With their usual confidence in Alexander, his men frightened off the elephants and won the battle. With northern India under control, Alexander and his army chopped down trees, made great wooden rafts, and rowed them down the wide Indus River into central India. But when the soldiers heard that Alexander intended to conquer the rest of India, for the first time they refused to obey him. Why do you think his men refused to obey Alexander? Men who had been with him from the start explained, we have marched by your side and fought as brothers under your command for 13 years. We are far from Macedonia. Please take us home. Alexander could not deny his men's request, so they turned around for home. That is, when Alexander discovered that he was not a god. At only 33 years old, Alexander had lived through enough adventures for 100 lifetimes, and had worn out the energetic body he had built to such great strength as a youngster. He fell ill, still many miles from home. Alexander lay in his tent. His generals gathered around him, each hoping to become king and rule Alexander's great empire after his death. They asked, to which of us do you leave your empire? He laughed and answered, to the strongest. Then he closed his eyes. He had laughed because he knew what would happen next. And he turned out to be right. Fighting for control of his empire, his men would break it into pieces. None of them would match his record as the mightiest conqueror of all. As a result, he would never be forgotten. He would always be remembered as Alexander the Great. So did Alexander obtain undying fame he hoped to achieve? So were your predictions about Alexander's greatest adventure correct? That he conquered so many areas? What happened to Alexander and his army in India? What would you have done if you were Alexander the Great and had already conquered Greece and Persia? Would you have stopped there? Or would you have continued conquering foreign lands? Why or why not? So here's a quick picture of where Alexander was and what he conquered. So here's the map, and you can see on this map there's these dashed lines. So this would be Alexander's empire. So you can see he comes down to Egypt and it spreads all the way. Here's India, here's the Indus River. He conquered all of these areas. All of these became his. Wow, that's a huge part of the globe. So our word for today is the word invader. I will read the word. You repeat it after me. Invader. What vowel is saying its long sound in this word? Which vowel is saying its short sound? What do you think the word invader means? So invader is a person who enters a place, such as a country, by force in order to conquer it. I think of, I don't play Minecraft, but I feel like these guys, these little zombies, are invaders. They come into your little town or home or whatever, and you have to try to defeat them because they're invading you. Alexander the Great became a famous invader of the Persian Empire. Have you ever heard of someone who was an invader? Again, as we look at our Greek civilization chart, we just finished up our leader of Alexander the Great. And I want you to write about one of the adventures that was your favorite from Alexander the Great. So you could talk about how he defeated the Persian army. Maybe that was your favorite. Maybe your favorite was when he went up against the people of India and he had a fight against elephants. Maybe his greatest adventure was something that you heard in the last read aloud, like taming the horse or learning from Aristotle. So I want you to pick one of those and use a complete sentence to write about one of Alexander the Great's greatest adventures. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Greek civilizations. There's just so many awesome contributions that they made that we still use today. And we will continue actually talking about the Greeks. And this time we're going to talk about the Greek gods. And they came up with these things called myths. So we're going to move into some fictional stories now as we continue on in our read alouds.